Cute anime girls getting mixed up in dangerous, near-death situations while attempting to expose world-shattering conspiracies is a plot that should be a recipe for success. So where did it all go so wrong? My name is Graeldon, and I'm reviewing Steam games in alphabetical order to find the hidden gems among the piles of garbage, and today we're reviewing the final game in the punctuation section of Steam. /conspiracy/girls, The Madness of Madison Delaroux. Let's begin. If you spend any amount of time trolling the depths of the internet, you might be familiar with the social cesspool that is 4chan. Conspiracy Girls is a visual novel released in October 2022 by House Delaroux, and the protagonist, Madison, is the living embodiment of a 4chan dweller that escaped into the real world. Or at least the way she speaks reads like what someone thinks a permanently online socially inept teenager would act like. With lines like this, Madison is the closest to cringe personified that I think I've ever encountered. So just who is Madison Delaroux? Self-titled as the exposer of conspiracies, Madison has made it her life's mission to interfere with them, a mysterious group purported to be pulling the strings and ruling the world from behind the scenes. It's worth pointing out that them, or any variant of that word with 3 parentheses, are used in the real world to refer to Jews. It should go without saying that I don't support any of the views displayed in this game, but it's also worth pointing out that this game is set in a fictional world, and more importantly, the devs outright mention at the beginning that the entire game is a shitpost and should not be taken seriously. In my opinion, that doesn't excuse these references, but thankfully this is as deep as the comparisons seem to go, as the shadow government, which actually exists in this fictional world, is made up of a number of different members from different backgrounds, including, but not limited to, an actual cat girl and an army of goat people. So, yeah. We've already met Madison, but there's also Sachiko, a longtime friend of Madison's who was able to use magic to make ink do her bidding. Then there are the sisters Arashion and Annalie. Arashion is the older and more responsible sister who helps run a local tourist store that sells odds and ends, and she hates Sachiko. As for Annalie, the younger sister, she can create electricity and loves to play practical jokes with Madison. Next up is the store owner, a literal bird called Avalon. As the only male character in the game, Avalon is portrayed as a total pervert. Cool. And last, but certainly not least, is Madison's best friend and the everyman that the player will relate to the most because they do their best not to get caught up in Madison's madness, Ayano. Oh, and the narrator is apparently a separate character too. Basically, there's a pretty sizable cast of interesting characters, so that's a good start for a visual novel. It's a shame that half of them have personalities that grate so much that I could only tolerate them being on screen for a few minutes at a time. Thankfully, a few minutes is sometimes all you'll need because the game is highly likely to freeze, forcing you to quit back to the main menu. I wish I was joking. This happened around 10 times during my playthrough. So, while we're here, let's take a look at the options menu. It's fine, I guess. There's no graphical settings, but they aren't exactly needed. However, I would have appreciated some resolution settings. There's a handful of options for text speed and skip settings, and then separate bars for music, sound, and voices. By the way, if you were expecting these to be displaying the increments, you're wrong. These are sliding bars hidden behind the textures. Oh, and there's also no voice acting, so I don't know why there's a slider for that. The only thing worthy of note in the main menu is the chapter select screen. The game is divided into 6 chapters, with the story playing out over the course of all 6 like a stage play divided into 6 acts, and from here you can dive into any specific one you want, including from the moment you launch the game. That's right, the chapters aren't unlocked by completing the previous one, they are all available from the moment you launch the game. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it is a weird design choice. The other side effect of dividing the game into chapters is that you're kicked back to the title screen every time you finish one, which means you won't have one continuous save file. Again, it's a bit weird, but not bad. Alright then, let's look at the overall presentation. The character art is generally fine, with a decent level of detail and variety of poses and expressions for each character. If anything, the character design is one of the strongest aspects of the game. And keep in mind that doesn't mean it's good, because the devs instantly lose points for making the main villain of the plot, La Monarchia, look like this. I'm not sure if you can pick up on the subtleties of the character design, but if you look super closely, you may notice some differences. Sarcasm aside, I really don't understand why they chose to do this. All of the other characters are in a cutesy anime style, and then there's this one character drawn in a more Western style that stands out like a sore thumb. I thought that perhaps it was intentional, as only the villain is drawn this way. But no, because later in the story, Sachiko is also drawn in the same style while she's working at a cafe. Looking at the backgrounds, it appears they've used photographs with heavy artistic filters applied to them to give a painterly feel, which creates a nice softness and ambience to the environments, which are surprisingly varied, except for the ones that are clearly hand-created computer graphics. And lastly, the music. There's a large range of tracks with several character and mood themes, and I think it's been utilised well, as even towards the end of the game there are still new tracks being used. None of the music is original though, but they have used some clever selections from well-known providers of free music such as Clevin MacLeod. So the devs get some points back for working creatively within budget constraints here, because goodness knows getting music rights is expensive. This brings us to our final discussion point, the plot and gameplay. In a nutshell, the plot is complete and utter nonsense, but then from a self-proclaimed shitpost, what were you expecting? You'll spend most of your time reading inane conversations that are totally irrelevant, and then have a few seconds of actual plot progression. There are two things in particular that the game does that are points of frustration that will turn away most players. The first is the overuse of words that require translation. This could be because they are terms that only those born and raised on the internet would know, or because they are literally in another language. A note for aspiring devs: if the narrative cannot be followed because keywords or phrases are unreadable to the majority of players, you'll force them to pull out their phones, at which point you've lost them, because browsing Instagram or playing another round of Subway Surfers is infinitely more interesting than googling phrase after phrase to play a mediocre, wannabe edgy anime visual novel. Sorry, where was I? Oh yeah, the second thing. Overuse of narrative tropes. There were at least 2 occasions where a new chapter starts with a scene, then rewinds to explain how they got to that scene, and then finally carries on. It's fine as a plot device, but it gets old extremely quickly. Another example is that almost every chapter ends with a character in some sort of trouble, usually one that should result in death or injury. After they get saved in a wacky way for the second or third time, it becomes predictable. And no, they don't subvert expectations in the later chapters by actually killing off a character. And this brings me to my next point, the gameplay, or lack thereof, because there isn't any. You click to progress the story unless the game breaks. There are no choices to make, no branching paths, no alternative endings. But I can't even be mad, because on the Steam store page, the devs mention that this is a kinetic, linear visual novel. So egg on my face for not reading. Still, I would have appreciated some amount of player input, even if just to break up the monotonous pacing of the story. And it would have made sense in the context of the game as well. With Ayano serving as the stand-in for the player in many ways, it would have made sense for the player to make choices and decisions in her role as wannabe detective, trying to piece together the clues and guess at the madness in Madison's mind. It's definitely a missed opportunity. And for my final point, the writing itself. One of the most frustrating things to deal with as a reader, other than the many spelling mistakes and misattributed lines, is the constant back and forth between using Ayano as the narrator and using an actual narrator. It's just bad writing, plain and simple. Either Ayano and her thoughts provide the narration, or the narrator does. Not both. But then again, why am I expecting quality writing from a self-proclaimed shitpost? For a game that's meant to be about conspiracies, I was expecting some hot takes, some well-known conspiracies, and maybe some lesser-known ones as well. You know, proper tinfoil hat-wearing stuff. But I came away from the game disappointed, because it was more about the idea of chasing down and exposing conspiracies than it was about discussing and proving or disproving specific conspiracies. In some ways, that's probably a good thing because I don't think my channel could handle another conspiracy-laden game. There's some internet edgelord humour, but in reality it's just the story of a paranoid girl who thinks she's being stalked by a shadow organisation and how people don't believe her, until she's actually revealed to be right. Strangely enough, this means it has more in common with The Boy Who Cried Wolf than an Alex Jones podcast episode. My final playtime for the game was just over 6 hours, and at a price of $20.49 Canadian, or your regional equivalent, you might get your money's worth if you enjoy subpar visual novels. I have very little visual novel experience. In fact, the only ones I've played have been on this channel. So in terms of rankings, it's above the likes of Doki Doki Family, but far below To Do Today. If anything, it's on par with the B-Hop Simulator visual novel, if that's a comparison that means anything to you. Between the bugs, the terrible pacing, frequent inane conversations, and the constant need to pause the game and Google the latest internet phrase or literally translate the on-screen text, I felt myself constantly frustrated and bored with the game. I'm sure someone might enjoy this, but certainly not me. That said, I'd be curious to see the devs try again, because I think they understand the fundamentals well enough to make something of quality. Tell your story from a more consistent perspective, spend less time on jokey character interactions that don't progress the narrative or character development, and find a way to create some real stakes that keep the player invested. With all of that in mind, my final rating for /conspiracy/girls, The Madness of Madison Delaroux is... out of 10. Thanks for watching. Welcome to the end of the video. A massive thank you to all the channel members on screen for supporting the channel, especially our 2 Knights of the Holy Grail, Freaky Feline and Loveheart Gonzi. These wonderful people are keeping this channel alive, and becoming a member costs as little as $1 per month. Just click the join button to see the available membership levels and perks. Thank you for joining me on this weird gaming adventure through the depths of Steam, and I'll see you next time in the first of the numbered games. Until then, take care.